This spot isn't for you two. Your place is over by the trash, behind the kitchen. My son said it right there in the middle of his wedding reception, where my name was still printed on the place card. He pulled the chair out, pointed toward the far end of the room, where the kitchen trash bins were hidden behind a thin curtain. 150 people went silent. My wife lowered her head. I stood up, straightened my old suit jacket, and walked. In that moment, no one knew that the chair being pushed away would become the place where every secret finally began to surface. If you're listening to this right now, go ahead and subscribe, and leave me a line telling me where you're listening from. Now, let me continue. Because from the moment I walked toward that table, nothing ever went back to the way it was. I walked slowly, not out of fear, but because I needed to keep my own balance. The wooden floor of the old estate creaked softly beneath my worn shoes. The music kept playing behind me, steady and cheerful, as if nothing had just happened. No one stood up. No one called my name. Crystal glasses were still being raised. Smiles stayed fixed on the guests' faces, people pretending not to see me at all. The table Brandon pointed to sat right by the kitchen entrance. A cream-colored fabric curtain hung halfway closed. Behind it, cold white light and the smell of unfinished food. I pulled the chair out for Dorothy first. She trembled slightly. Not from the cold. I could see her hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth as if she might disappear if she let go. "It's okay," I said, quietly, just loud enough for the two of us. My voice was calm. So calm, it surprised even me. Maybe after 70 years of living, I'd learned how to swallow everything whole. This table had no flowers, no candles, no name cards. Just two plain wooden chairs, the kind staff used during short breaks. I held the chair for my wife, waited for her to sit, then took the seat across from her. As I sat down, a young server glanced at us, hesitated for a couple of seconds, then turned away, as if we had never been there at all. I looked toward the main table. The Thorne family sat at the center. Richard leaned back in his chair, wineglass in hand, laughing loudly. Victoria was saying something to the person beside her, a look of satisfaction on her face. Brandon sat between them. His new suit fit perfectly. His face glowed under the lights, and with something else I didn't want to name. Vanessa tilted her head, whispering into her husband's ear. Her lips pressed into a thin smile, and then it hit me. Through the entire ceremony, Brandon hadn't looked at me for more than a second. His eyes passed over me the way you glance at an old object left in the wrong place. Dorothy lowered her head. I heard her take a deep breath, trying to keep a sob from slipping out. She's always been like that. Her whole life, Dorothy has been afraid of bothering people, afraid of ruining the mood, afraid of becoming a burden. Even now, being pushed away from her own son's wedding table, she stayed silent. I placed my hand over hers, not gripping, just resting it there. A small gesture, but enough to remind us both that we were still here, still existing. In that moment, I wasn't angry. I felt empty. A cold feeling spread from my chest down into my stomach, like standing alone on the deck of a ship in the middle of a long night at sea. You don't panic. You just understand that if you don't hold yourself steady, no one else will do it for you. The host's voice rang out bright and cheerful, introducing the important members of the bride's family. Applause came right on cue. Perfect, even, rehearsed. When Brandon's name was announced, the whole room lit up. When it came time to introduce the groom's parents, the host paused for a brief moment, then moved straight on to the next segment. No questions, no objections. I looked down at the napkin in front of me. Clean, white, untouched. I folded it carefully and set it aside. A meaningless act, but it kept my mind from drifting. A memory surfaced. Years ago, an evening long past, Brandon was younger then, sitting across from me in our small kitchen. He talked about his dreams, his big plans, his desire to rise to a different place in society. I listened. I nodded. I believed that if I stepped back one pace, my son could move forward much farther. Laughter from the main table pulled me back to the present. Vanessa stood up, raised her glass, and spoke polished words about family, about the people who brought us here today. Her eyes swept over Dorothy and me. Didn't stop, didn't linger, as if we were just a minor detail in a much larger picture. Dorothy turned to me and whispered, "Maybe we should leave early." I shook my head, not because I wanted to stay, but because I knew If we left quietly now, everything would end right there. No one would remember. No one would ask a single question. We would simply be two old people who didn't know their place, fading out of the perfect image they were creating. "Let's sit for now," I said. "Eat a little something." Our food arrived later than everyone else's. By the time the plate touched the table, it was already cold. I didn't complain. I never learned how to complain. I looked around the room, at unfamiliar faces, expensive clothes, carefully measured smiles, and for the first time that night, I understood my position. Not the position of the chair, but my place. In my son's heart, right there, at that table beside the trash bins. Between the smell of leftover food and the cold kitchen lights, I began to think about the questions I had avoided for many years. And I knew, once those questions appeared, there would be no going back to the way things were before. I didn't stay until the end of the reception. When dessert was brought out to the main tables, I stood up, helped Dorothy to her feet, and quietly left the estate. No one walked us out. No one asked a thing. The heavy wooden doors closed behind us, cutting off the music and the lights, like shutting the door on a room that had become too full. The night wind in Newport carried the smell of the sea. Dorothy walked slowly, leaning on my arm. She didn't say a word on the way back to the hotel. That silence wasn't blame. It was something more tired than that. Like when you've hoped for too long and no longer have the strength to ask another question. Back in the room, Dorothy sat on the bed and slipped off the shoes that had hurt her feet all evening. I poured her a glass of water and set it on the table beside her. She looked at me. Her lips moved like she wanted to say something, then stopped. In the end, she asked just one quiet question. "Did we do something wrong?" That question stayed with me for a long time, even after Dorothy had fallen asleep. I sat alone by the window, looking down at the wide lawn in front of the hotel. The distant lights flickered like small ships drifting through the night. I wondered what I had missed, or whether I had given so much that no one remembered why they ever needed me in the first place. The next morning, Dorothy said she felt tired and wanted to rest in the room. I left her there, put on my jacket, and went back to the estate. Not because I wanted an explanation. I just wanted to pick up my suit jacket, the one that had been stained with wine and sent to the cleaners the night before. A reasonable excuse to return, one that didn't invite questions. The estate was much quieter in the morning. The ribbons were still hanging, but the banquet tables were gone. I walked down the hallway, feeling like I was moving through a place that was familiar, and yet not. As I neared the dressing rooms in the back, I heard voices drifting out. I was about to turn away when I heard my name. Vanessa spoke first. Her voice wasn't gentle anymore. "I don't understand why you're still letting them stay involved with the paperwork. Everything needs to be finished before he starts asking questions." Brandon answered lower, more hurried. "Relax. He already signed. Nobody noticed the last few times. And besides, he doesn't really understand this stuff." I stood still behind the cold stone wall, not because I was shocked, but because a familiar feeling was starting to take shape. The feeling you get when you begin connecting scattered pieces, and the picture that appears is nothing like what you believed. Vanessa let out a soft laugh. "Once we pull the rest from the fund, it's done. The beach house, too. I've had someone review the files already. We just need one more signature." "Don't worry," Brandon said. "My parents trust me completely." I didn't listen any further. Not because I couldn't bear it, but because I had heard enough. I turned and walked away, each step feeling like another heavy stone being placed on my chest. For 5 years, I had transferred more money to Brandon than I had ever promised. I had signed papers without reading them carefully, because I believed my son would never put me in a difficult position. Outside, I sat down on a stone bench. Sunlight spread across the lawn. It was beautiful, peaceful. I thought about our old family farm, the one I sold to help my son get started. I remembered the day I signed the papers. Dorothy stood beside me, holding my hand. She believed, the same way I did, that it was the right thing to do. I also thought about Brandon's calls, how they had grown fewer and farther between. The times I suggested visiting and always heard the same answer: "I'm really busy these days." I had accepted it as normal. Young people are busy. New lives. New families. But that morning, with Vanessa's and Brandon's words still echoing in my head, I began to see everything differently. The rushed money transfers, the contracts that just needed a quick signature, the vague promises about projects I had never once seen a complete report for. I stood up and went back toward the dressing room after they had left. A few folders were still open on the table. I didn't touch them. I just looked. Figures, company names, and familiar signatures at the bottom of the pages. My signature, or at least something that looked like it. On my way out of the estate, my phone rang. It was an old friend, someone I had worked with years ago in maritime shipping. He asked casually whether I had really agreed to guarantee a large loan recently. I told him I didn't remember. There was a short silence on the other end. Then he said, "You might want to check that." That afternoon I sat in the small hotel room and opened the briefcase I always carry when I travel. I pulled out copies of contracts, bank statements I had only skimmed before. This time, I read every line, slowly, very slowly, and the pieces began to fit together. It wasn't just the coldness, it wasn't just the chair being pushed away. It was a trap, built from my own trust. The Thorne family wasn't as wealthy as they appeared. The projects they bragged about were built on my old reputation. That lavish wedding wasn't meant to celebrate happiness. It was meant to display a shell. When Dorothy woke up, I didn't tell her anything. I just said I needed to step out for a bit. Some truths, if spoken too early, only cause more pain, without offering a way forward. That evening, as the city lights came on, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear, and in that clarity I understood that the table by the trash bins the night before wasn't the end. It was simply the place where I was finally forced to open my eyes. I didn't go back to the hotel right away that night. I drove along the coastline, the sea wind coming through the cracked window. The road was empty. Yellow streetlights stretched into thin lines across the pavement. I needed space to think. But more than that, I needed to act while my mind was still clear enough to separate emotion from fact. There was one place I knew I had to go. A low, aging building not far from the harbor. A law office I used to visit often years ago, back when I was still working in the industry. The sign out front was faded, but the name was still there. I parked the car and stood still for a few seconds before going in, like I was knocking on a part of my past. I had tried to keep closed for a long time. The night clerk recognized me after a moment. He didn't ask many questions, just nodded and unlocked the inner door. I walked straight into my old office. The room hadn't changed. The dark wooden desk, the tall bookshelves reaching the ceiling, and the safe built deep into the wall behind a framed painting of the sea. I opened the safe using numbers I had never once forgotten. Inside were neatly stacked folders wrapped in worn cardboard covers, ship blueprints, technology transfer contracts, financial records I once believed I would never need again. I laid them out on the desk, one by one, slowly, like I was reviewing my own life. That night I didn't feel tired. Clarity kept my back straight as I read every page. I noticed funds being withdrawn in a pattern I knew too well. Not random, not careless, calculated. I also noticed the name of a company I had never signed with directly, yet it appeared again and again in the transactions. That name led to another. Richard Thorne. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a few seconds. Not to escape, but to put everything in order. Brandon hadn't done all of this alone. He never had the patience or the discipline to build something this intricate. Someone was behind him, someone guiding him, someone using my silence and my trust to open doors I never imagined. I turned on the computer and logged into accounts known only to me and a very small circle of people. Old designs, long thought dormant, were still there. I checked the access logs. There were unfamiliar traces, not obvious, but clear enough for someone from the field to recognize intrusion, not directly from me, but through information only Brandon could access. Near midnight, I made a phone call. Short, direct, just confirming a few things. The person on the other end stayed quiet for a long moment, then let out a heavy breath. "This isn't small," he said. "You should protect yourself immediately." I hung up and looked at the clock. The hour hand had passed 2 a.m. The city outside was asleep. I wasn't. I opened my email and began drafting messages one by one. No rush, no anger. I sent what mattered. Statements, signature samples, timelines, to banks, to former partners, and to authorities responsible for handling document fraud. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply presented the facts. Objective, clear, the same way I had written technical reports for decades. Truth, when placed correctly, does the work on its own. After sending the final email, I sat there for a long time. No sense of victory, no relief, just a long stillness, where I realized I had crossed a line. From a father who always stepped back, to a man who had to stand upright to protect what remained of his life. Dawn was breaking when I left the office. I drove back toward the sea and parked in a quiet lot. The water was calm, reflecting the pale light of early morning. I sat in the car, both hands on the steering wheel, thinking about Dorothy, thinking about her face when she asked whether we had done something wrong. I returned to the hotel just as she was waking up. Dorothy looked at me. She seemed to sense something in my eyes, but she didn't ask. I made her a cup of tea and pulled a chair across from her. We sat there for a while, in silence. Some changes don't need explanations. By noon, my phone began to vibrate. Not constantly, but steadily. Calls from unfamiliar numbers. Short, polite messages asking to clarify a few details. I responded just enough. No more, no less. I knew that somewhere back in that grand estate, Brandon and the Thorne family were still enjoying the afterglow of the wedding. They had no idea that doors were beginning to close. Quietly, without drama, layers of protection they believed they had were being removed, one by one. As evening fell, Dorothy and I packed our things to leave Newport. Before closing my briefcase, I looked once more at the files that had sat untouched for too long. I felt no resentment, only regret, for a stretch of time when I chose trust instead of looking straight ahead. As the car rolled out of the city, I didn't look back. I knew that what began at that table beside the trash bins wasn't over. It had simply moved into another phase, a phase where silence was no longer the only choice. We left Newport the following morning, but I knew the story there wasn't finished. It had only gone quiet, like the ocean surface just before the tide turns. On the drive home, Dorothy slept more than usual. I let her rest. There were things I hadn't said yet, not because I was hiding them, but because I needed to be sure that when the truth surfaced, it would stand on its own without me holding it up with emotion. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was watering the plants on the porch of our beach house. An unfamiliar number, a polite voice. He introduced himself as a representative from a bank that had worked with the Thorne family. He confirmed they had received my email and informed me that several transactions tied to my name had been temporarily frozen for review. I thanked him, ended the call, and went back to watering the plants. The water fell evenly into the sand, slow to soak in, but steady. That morning, I received a few more calls like that. No one asked me what to do next. They simply told me everything was being reviewed. I understood what that meant. Doors Brandon and his wife's family had grown used to opening in my name were now starting to close, one by one. Around noon, Dorothy sat with me in the living room, sunlight coming through the old window frame. She looked at me and finally asked, "What did you do?" "I just put the truth where it belongs," I said. It wasn't the full answer, but it was the most honest one I could give at that moment. Dorothy nodded. She didn't ask anything else. I knew she trusted me, even if she also sensed the days ahead wouldn't be peaceful. The next day, I received a short message from Brandon. Just one sentence. "Dad, what's going on?" I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone down. I didn't reply, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I knew anything I said right then would be twisted to serve the one asking. I had already said enough in those emails. The rest was no longer mine to explain. The Thorne family's post-wedding gathering went forward exactly as they had planned. I didn't know because I was invited. I knew because an old associate called me, his voice equal parts surprised and cautious. He asked if I would be attending because the atmosphere today feels different. I put on the suit Dorothy had kept neatly hung in the closet for years. Not my most expensive one, but the one I wear when I need to remember who I am. I drove back to Newport and arrived at the estate just as the luncheon began. The lawn was still green. The tables were still perfectly arranged, as if nothing underneath was cracking. I didn't walk in right away. I stood at the gate for a few minutes and took a long breath. I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to witness. Inside, conversations broke off when a group of well-dressed officials appeared. No shouting, no chaos, just brief statements, documents laid out, faces beginning to change. I saw Brandon frozen in place, a glass still in his hand. Richard Thorne tried to hold his smile, but his jaw tightened. I stepped inside once the space was quiet enough for my footsteps to echo clearly on the stone floor. A few people recognized me. Their eyes passed over, then lingered longer than usual. I nodded in greeting. Nothing more. A legal representative approached me, confirmed my identity, and politely asked if I would remain to clarify certain details. I agreed. I stood there in the middle of a perfectly manicured garden, and for the first time since the wedding night I felt things settling into their proper places. Explanations began to surface. Not from me. From documents, from numbers, from signatures that could no longer stand once placed beside the truth. They spoke about retirement funds, about loan guarantees, about cash flows used to pay for this estate, and for the lavish celebration they had just held. Vanessa stood close to Brandon, her face drained of color. She looked at me, then at her husband, as if realizing for the first time there was a distance between them that couldn't be crossed. Richard tried to speak, but his words were cut short by questions he couldn't convincingly answer. I didn't say a word until I was asked. When I did speak, I stated only what I knew, what I had already sent out. No emotion, no commentary. I didn't mention the table by the trash bins. I didn't mention Dorothy. Those things didn't belong to that afternoon. They belonged to me. When certain assets were announced as temporarily frozen for investigation, the confidence in the Thorne family's eyes collapsed quickly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just suddenly, like the lights going out in a crowded room. Brandon turned toward me. His eyes were full of confusion, anger, and fear. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I looked at my son, and for the first time in many years, I didn't try to shield him from the consequences of his own choices. The gathering ended earlier than planned. Guests left in silence, hurried handshakes, unfinished goodbyes. The grand estate became hollow like a stage after the lights go down. I left Newport for the second time that week, this time with a very different feeling. Not relief, but clarity. What needed to be exposed had been placed in the light. What remained I knew would no longer require my voice. On the drive home, I thought about Dorothy, about the beach house, about the quiet afternoons we had traded so much to earn. And I understood that in that moment, not only had a wedding ended, but a long-held illusion had finally closed its doors. I returned to the beach house in the late afternoon. The air was softer. The wind carried that familiar scent of salt. Dorothy was sitting on the old wooden chair on the porch, a light shawl over her shoulders. She looked up when she saw me. She didn't ask anything. She just smiled gently. That smile told me something important. No matter how much the past days had shaken things, this place was still waiting for us. Just the same. We ate a simple dinner, grilled fish, steamed vegetables, a bowl of warm soup. No music, no toasts, just the steady sound of the waves outside. Dorothy told me about her afternoon walk along the shore, about running into a few old friends. I listened. Peace doesn't come back with a sudden force. It returns through small details like that. In the days that followed, things moved forward in their own way. I didn't track every development. I received updates when necessary, answered questions when asked. Brandon and Richard faced the consequences of what they had done through the proper channels in the proper order. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel the pain I once thought I would. Maybe because I had already passed through that stage, back at the table by the trash bins, where I was forced to see everything clearly. Vanessa no longer appeared in calls or messages. I heard she had left Newport and taken a simpler job at a roadside restaurant. The news reached me like a piece of information. Nothing more. I didn't feel satisfaction. I just saw it plainly. The roles we choose determine the stage we end up standing on. One morning I received a letter confirming that the misused assets had been recovered. I read it slowly, folded it, placed it on the table. Dorothy looked at me, waiting. I told her we didn't need to change our life. She nodded, as if she already knew the answer. We talked for a long time, not about the money, but about what should be done with it. Dorothy spoke about young people she had met in town, hard-working, always just one opportunity short of moving forward. I thought about my early years at sea when I was once a young man who needed a hand offered at the right moment. A few weeks later, we signed the final papers to establish a small fund. No family name, no large sign, just a quiet commitment to support education and training for young people from working families. When I signed, my hand felt steadier than I expected. Some signatures had been misused before, and some signatures, this time, were placed exactly where they belonged. I received a call from Brandon late in the evening. His voice wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't pleading either, just tired. He apologized. Briefly, not perfectly. I listened without interrupting. When he fell silent, I told him I hoped he would learn something from all of this. Not to please me, but to live the rest of his life with less weight. The call ended without promises. I don't know if we'll ever sit at the same table again. I'm not sure I still need that answer. Some distances don't need to be closed by returning, but by a new kind of respect. Summer passed slowly. Dorothy and I repaired the old dining table in the house. I sanded the surface. She wiped it clean. We moved it closer to the window so the morning light could fall directly onto the wood. A few close friends stopped by. No one asked about the wedding. No one mentioned the estate. We talked about the sea, the weather, small things enough to feel that we were living. One afternoon, after everyone had left, Dorothy placed her hand on the table and said she liked its new position. I looked around. There was no seat of honor, no seat pushed away, just chairs at the same level. I thought back to that night in Newport when I stood up under the bright lights and walked toward the far end of the room. At the time, I thought I was accepting a lower place. Now I understand I was stepping out of a picture that no longer had room for truth. The sun set. Dorothy and I sat side by side listening to the waves. I thought about all the tables I've sat at in my life, work tables, dining tables, conference tables, and I understood something clearly. A person's place isn't decided by where they're told to sit, but by how they stand up when it matters. The table in the beach house isn't grand, but that evening it was filled with real laughter, and for me, that is enough. Maybe I'm not telling this story to prove I was right. I'm telling it because there are evenings when everything has settled, and I realize I stayed silent for too long, at moments when I should have spoken. If you've ever been there, remember this: silence isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's just justice delayed. If this story made you pause for a moment, consider liking it, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone who might need a calm, unspoken kind of story. That helps the channel keep telling real stories, slow ones, with depth. Thank you for staying. Sometimes what matters most isn't where you're invited to sit, but knowing when to stand up and walk away with your dignity fully intact.